Hello, this is my latest photography tutorial. In this one we're going to look at stitching panoramics. That's the idea that you move your camera around left, right, up and down and capture lots of pictures of an area, and then using Photoshop we bring those images together to create a large panoramic which brings all the images together. A lot of my landscape photographs are done using this technique. So I'll be showing you how to use the camera to capture those images and then also use Photoshop to bring them together. Before I show you that technique, I'm going to show you a quick slideshow of images where I've used this technique, and I'll talk you through them and what I achieved by putting these images together.
I'm going to start this slideshow with a very quick film. This film is a little thing I've put together that zooms right into one of my stitched images, one of my stitched panoramics. One of the great things about joining lots of images together to make a landscape or a cityscape is you get the resolution of each of those images. So you get the full frame resolution from a camera of each of those images. In this tutorial we're going to look at a set of 9 images. So you've got your central image and then 8 images around it, and you gain all those extra pixels, and it means you start getting very, very detailed images, very, very big files, very detailed images. And some of the images I work on and create panoramics of, I use more than 9. I might use 15, 25, even over 100. And that means when you zoom right into the middle of the image, you see all this resolution, all this detail, texture, distant information that's all kind of almost hidden there, but once you zoom in you see it. So I've just created a little animation of this which takes you right into the detail of Manchester in the distance there. But every photograph I show you in this slideshow has got a similar level of detail if you were to zoom in. So let me hit play and we can kind of move into that detail. And here we go. We're starting to see the distant towers, the cranes, the churches, the town hall, the landscape beyond Manchester. There's so much in these images, and I love that idea that you can print them up massive. This could be printed 5 meters across and you wouldn't see pixels, you would see detail. And actually in this image you can see the lines have a slight shiver to them, and that's nothing to do with the resolution of the camera. That's the atmosphere. If you shoot with a long enough lens, you start seeing atmospheric distortion. So you see a slight wobble, and that's because you're shooting through so much atmosphere to get to the buildings. But yeah, I just love that sort of resolution and detail that you can pick up in these images. So we'll crack on with the rest of the slideshow now. This is a panoramic image from the top of the Roaches in Staffordshire. By shooting it as a panoramic, I shot it on quite a wide angle lens, but I was able to move the camera around, do a central image for where the sun was, move left of that, take a few pictures to the left, move up, down, right, all over, and just collect so much detail. And by doing that, you can really put the viewer amongst the landscape. You can make it feel like they can almost step onto that rock in front. You can almost see that you get a sense of the rocks to the left and the right being to the side of you. If that's printed big enough, you feel like you could be there, which I really like with photography. I like photographs that give a sense of the experience of being in these places. And I find by stitching them and bringing images together, I'm able to do that. I'm able to create these little portals to the landscape that you feel you can almost step into. This is a stitched panoramic, but from a bit more of a long lens. I think a lot of the stitched panoramics I'm going to show you were shot with fairly wide lens, maybe at around 35mm, 50mm. This would have been shot with maybe a 200mm lens. So it's kind of a distant view, but by shooting it with a very long lens, I could capture it in really fine detail and make it really big. And then I can kind of work into the colors because there's so much resolution there. I can really work into the kind of detail and create kind of lovely effects of the light by putting all these images together, shot with quite a long lens. This is a rock formation in the Peak District on Derwent Edge. So I was there and the snow was falling and I was crunching through it, and it was a really beautiful time to be up there. It was pretty chilly, but I think it was so exciting to be photographing this view of the rocks that it didn't really affect me too much. But this is a panoramic, so I'd have moved the camera, started in the center, move the camera left and right, up and down to capture all that detail and cram it in. And I think the end image was even wider than this, but I sometimes crop in just so you really focus on the rock formations and really kind of see the heart of the image. But yeah, sometimes when you're in the landscape, I just shoot lots, particularly when it's a situation like this where it's snowing, it's a little bit hard to concentrate. I'll probably shoot maybe 60 images. I maybe used about 30 of them to build this. but then maybe I did the same rock formation about 6 times. I would have photographed it lots of different ways, slightly different positions as the light changed. And I just know as I review them back in my studio, there'll be one that works better than all the others. So it's about shooting a lot and then back in the studio, selecting the best ones and then working into them, doing this panoramic work that we're going to look at in this tutorial. This is a kind of, I guess you'd call this a macro panoramic. So, or it's maybe a stitched macro is probably the best way of describing it. So it's using a macro lens, but it's stitched out of about 12 images. So I would have photographed the area where the sun is first, and then move left of there, move left further, then above it, below it. I would have created about maybe 15, 20 images of this view. So you get this kind of odd combination of effects. With a macro lens, you get a very, very shallow depth of field. And with a stitched image, you get a kind of wideness. So you're getting two things going on here. You get this incredibly shallow depth of field, which adds to the atmosphere, which knocks all the rest of the countryside out of focus and the sun out of focus. But then you've still got a lot of width to the image as well. You've still got a lot left and right of it. So it's interesting because you've got that sharpness, which is quite kind of appealing. It kind of catches your eyes. But then this kind of wideness, it's almost this kind of a lot of detail crammed in there as well through the stitched image making. And here's another one zooming right into the head of the dandelion, but then moving left and right of there, below it, above it. So you've got that sharpness, that incredibly shallow depth of field on the dandelion, and then as soon as you get a half a centimetre in front of that, half a centimetre behind that, it falls out of focus. But then because it's stitched, you've got a lot of image around it. You've got a lot more of a sense of the grass, the sun, the wider landscape. Here's another stitched macro shot. So I'm using that idea that a macro lens can focus on one point and let everything else fall totally out of focus. And it really catches the eye. The eye focuses in on that one sharp point. It kind of really is quite, it's quite kind of appealing to the eye. If I photographed this and everything was in focus, it would be a much less kind of dynamic image. That sharpness really kind of draws you in. Here's one of the first images I created using the panoramic style that was successful, I would say. This is of a wheat field in Essex, and I'd been trying these ideas out, this idea of stitching 5 images together from my local park on grey days, experimenting. But this is the first image where it really came together when I stood in front of a beautiful view. The light was good, the view was good, and I put it together. And my early ones, I used to let the horizons, as I stitched them, you used to get these quite fluid shapes to them, this kind of almost liquid shaped horizons. And my earlier work did this more. I think I now try and control things more. But this next set of images are fairly early landscapes which have that kind of fluid horizon. This one's from an orchard in the Fens in Cambridgeshire. And again, you can see there the kind of horizon has this odd shape. You might find as you're stitching images together and putting them together, they kind of can go together in quite unusual shapes, or you can have to reshape them or rework them, or the horizons and straight lines go a little bit odd. You can kind of work with this. It can, you can make this a feature. If the shape is suddenly quite interesting and organic and got a nice flow to it, you can make it more so. You can make that part of the image. And I think in my earlier images, I did that more than I do now. And this one, again, is an earlier one, and you can see that shape. It's an olive grove in Corfu, but the hill and the way the horizon changes and maybe the verticals of the trees change. It's quite nice. You're kind of reworking reality, taking what's in front of you and reshaping it, and it almost looks like an illustration because but it's confusing because it's a photograph, you're looking at the real world, but it's a bit off. It kind of got this middle ground between illustration and photography, which I like to play with in that area. And I guess this one is probably the most extreme where the horizon's been played with. This is a wind farm near Halifax. I think it's called Ovidon Moor, and I've deliberately let the horizon be this kind of curving shape that fits the composition. It was kind of an early thing I used to play with a lot, which I don't do as much. I think I like my images a bit more regimented, full of detail and life and texture, but a bit more kind of solid and grounded these days. This is working with panoramics at night and also blending exposures a little bit. I do another tutorial where I look at bracketing exposures and blending exposures. So I would have moved the camera left and right to capture this expanse of moonlit, snow-covered landscape. But then I would have done a number of exposures of the cottage, so I could blend the light, I could keep details in the window. So sometimes I use two effects. I use a panoramic stitch and then a bracketed blended exposure within one photograph. And here's another working at night. This is from the Northumberland countryside, shooting up at the Milky Way. But I shot the camera with the camera straight up, and then I moved the tripod so it leant back on itself, and then I moved it so it kind of slowly came forward. And if you look at the trees to the bottom of the image, you're almost looking at them straight on. You've got this kind of almost kind of 180 of detail above you, and that's stitched not out of many images. That's maybe stitched out of only 4 images, but it allowed me to really play with this idea of silhouetting the trees, creating the silhouettes of the forest and the trees against the Milky Way and the stars. Because I could stitch a few wide angle images together, I could really show that. I could create lots of silhouettes and show lots of the night sky against it, which was really helpful. This is a wide angle stitched image. Again, the wide angle nature of these images can really draw your eyes in. You can really work with perspective, and the wide angle feel makes it feel like you can step into them, because there's so much in the image, including the stones and rocks right in front of your feet. You almost feel like you can take a step forward and be there. And I really like that about the photographs I take. I always try and make it feel like an experience. I get to these places, kind of hike up hills, get access to strange buildings, and I want to sort of take the people there with me. I want people to feel like they've been there, looked at this view, got a sense of the atmosphere, but then also got a sense of the whole place as well. And by shooting panoramic images and stitching them, I can cram a lot of detail in there and really show it all to you, not just a bit of the landscape. I can show you all of the landscape. And another one here, this is Snowdon, actually on the same day as the image I just showed you. This is leaving Snowdon, where the sun had gone down. It's just catching the clouds, underneath of the clouds. And by shooting maybe 15-20 images of this, I could capture this really wide, really beautiful, subtle lit landscape, and cram an awful lot of detail in there, show a lot in one photograph. And this is another way I'm showing lots. Right from that foreground detail, you feel like you're sat in the bracken, almost laying back in the grass. And because I can shoot so wide, I can have the trees around me, left and right of me, and I can almost create this idea of this kind of frame within a frame. The hills in the landscape beyond, that's almost a photograph in itself. But because I've created it as a panoramic stitched image, I can keep that very detailed, but then I can have more detail of the trees around it as we get nearer, the bracken in front, and create these images that almost take your eyes on a journey, almost kind of draw your eyes in and take them around this view and this landscape. And it's by having all that detail and being able to take pictures facing left of myself, then move the camera right round through 180 degrees, face right of myself, and capture all of the view in front of me and really place a person in these landscapes. And it can be useful if you're in kind of very tight, contained surroundings or locations. This is a Cathedral Caverns in the Lake District, so I couldn't really get that far back. I was right against the wall behind me. I was kind of leaning against a cold, damp wall. But by using a combination of a wide angle lens and then stitching probably about 15 images together, I could show it all, not just a bit of it. I could really show that kind of almost 180 of detail in front of me, really left and right, more than I could see with my eyes. I'd have to move my head to see all that detail. I couldn't see it in one go. And it's that idea of stitching allows me to do that. It allows me to show all of a place, not just one element of it. It allows me to put the viewer in there and make them feel like they're kind of in these amazing spaces. And you can go very wide with panoramics. This is Cape Canaveral, the Kennedy Space Centre's in the distance there. The sun is actually rising just above platform 39A, which is where the Apollo missions launched from. I managed to get in a position where the sun was taking off just from there. And I spoke to some people that were there, and they told me about night launches of the rockets and said it almost went daylight for a few seconds. So I never got to see a launch while I was there. I was part of a digital arts festival in Florida, but by photographing the sun just above 39A, it felt like that might be how a launch would look at night, where you've got the glow of the rocket and the whole sky lights up for 30 seconds or a very short amount of time. But this is a panoramic, so I would have moved the camera left and then slowly moved it around in a row, maybe taking 20 pictures. So you've got this very wide shot and then stitch them together. So you've got this whole view in front of you, this real kind of wide image that you just wouldn't get from one photograph. And by stitching it together, I'm not having to use a fisheye lens to get this really wide image. So I can control it. I can keep the horizon lovely and straight. I can keep the detail. I can keep it very ordered. So you can create incredibly wide shots. I like the idea that you're not tied into usual formats of cameras. You're not tied into 35mm format. You can work with whatever format the image needs. So the image needed a very wide, very kind of long landscape format here. So that's what it becomes. That's what the crop becomes. I like that. I just let the image and the view dictate the crop, and I don't let these kind of arbitrary sizes of the chip on your camera or the 35mm film kind of dictate the size of my images. Here's one of rocks in Snowdonia. Again, you can get very, very close and then shoot wide, so you can get right amongst it. You feel like you can touch the rocks. You feel like you've kind of got this unusual, almost kind of alien-looking landscape in front of you. But by getting very close and shooting it very wide, I could kind of emphasize these strange kind of sculptural shapes of the rock formations. Here's another one where you're putting the viewer right in this view. This is a sunrise in the Peak District. So by getting low down, by getting amongst the kind of fern-covered, mossy walls of this little kind of gully, this little stream running through, you feel like you're there. You feel like you're being contained by it. You're kind of amongst it, and it feels like an experience. Hopefully, it feels like that you maybe feel the warmth of the sun. You feel like you feel the kind of, the whole of the view. You feel like you could step into it, maybe even hear the drips of the river. This is one, there's a few now where I've kind of experimented with the form, I guess. This is something that I did maybe 2 or 3 years into working with panoramic images. And this one is actually shot using a number of lenses. So the vineyard elements in the foreground were shot on a wide angle lens, but by shooting on such a wide angle lens, the abbey in the distance becomes tiny. So I used a much longer lens and stood at a high angle and photographed the distant abbey and the trees in the distance and the hills. Then I think I maybe shot from about 6 different positions here and used maybe 3 different lenses, zoomed into different amounts. I basically took all these studies using different lenses of the landscape, and then back in my studio I put all these separate panoramics together. And this is kind of a step on from what I'm showing you in this tutorial. But this next set, I just wanted to show you how you can kind of play with the form and take it even further. You can stitch the view in front of you, but then you can also rework that view and tell different versions of it. You can create your own version of the view. Here's another one, a stitched panoramic, but also you can play with time. So all of these vehicles and planes were in front of me, but not at the same time. This is over about 40 minutes of activity in Hong Kong airport. They all pass in front of me. So I created a panoramic, left, right, up and down, capturing all the elements as I'm going to show you here. But then I also photographed the people and the planes and the vehicles in different positions and drop them in. Same technique, transforming layer masks, editing my layer masks, but to bring in all these elements from a whole spread of time. So you can be quite playful. You can play with the view in front of you. You can play with depth and shape and the 3D view, but then you can also play with time as well, which it just really opens up the possibilities of creative photography once you realize you can kind of take the world and remix it. Here's one where I created a panoramic of a view from a glacier in Iceland, but then just put a slight suggestion of the northern lights and the stars above. They were photographed on the same day, but not from the same place, but it's only a slight suggestion. And it was such a magical, kind of almost mystical view anyway. It felt like something out of a Philip Pullman book, like his Dark Materials, that just to add the slight suggestion of stars, even though it's quite unreal, and the glow of the northern lights just sort of created this unique, strange lit, kind of neon glowing landscape of. And it is, you go to Iceland and the landscape there is magical. Every corner you drive round, you get knocked back by the beauty of it. And this is maybe taking that and taking it kind of a step further into kind of illustration. But it's fun being able to do that. And here's a view of Manchester where there's actually 2, maybe even 3 different panoramics stitched together here, again over a span of time. So to the left of the image, you've got pictures from sunrise, so from sunset. Then you get to the middle image, you've got maybe 20 minutes later, it's getting a bit darker. Then to the right of the image, you've got pictures where it's very dark. And I blended them really carefully. I didn't want it to feel like it would be strips of different days. I wanted it to kind of slowly move from that warmth of the sunset and dusk on the left right through to the darkness and almost the coldness on the right. And I think the sky might have just been from one time. The whole sky might have been from earlier in the evening, but the city's from different times. So you can see how, again, it's all about playing with time and bringing different images together. Here's one from the Monsell Trail, and the train wasn't there. The train was from the Science and Industry Museum in Manchester, and the Monsell Trail is an old train track, but there haven't been trains on it since the 50s or 60s. So I put the tracks back on there using from one location, from another part of the Peak District, and the train from a museum in Manchester, the smoke from another place, and I slowly built up this kind of imagined landscape. Same techniques, layer masks, transforming, but instead of just bringing images together from one place, I'm bringing images together from different places. And it takes a bit more kind of creative thinking, a bit more kind of thinking around the subject to work out how to do it. But once you get a feel for how to stitch one view in front of you, you can start pushing that and start thinking, okay, if I can take that one view but then bring in one element, what will that look like? So it kind of evolves interest in an interesting way. This is one of a volcano in Iceland, and it was impossible to get this photograph. We were in a little four-seater plane, and there was only a small gap out the window, and there was a wing in the way. So the person flying it was really helpful, and he flew. We did about 3 circuits, and each time we banked in a different way. So one time we banked so the wing was kind of away from the volcano, and I got some of the higher elements because we were tipping up. And the next time we banked so the wing was kind of towards the volcano, and I got the lower elements. So there's 2 panoramics here. The lower element was from one circuit where we banked to get the lower bits, and then the upper element was from another circuit where we banked to get the higher bits. And I brought those 2 together, and by doing that I could get rid of the plane, the wings, I could get rid of the bars and the windows. It took a lot of work and a lot of kind of crowbarring elements, moving elements around, cloning, kind of working into it. But by doing that, you feel like you've got this single view. You feel like there's no plane. You feel like it was just a view from the sky. But that took a lot of kind of panoramic work, which is all stuff that I learned over time and I kind of came up with myself. But it all started from simply putting 9 images together, 3 images together from my local park, using the technique I'm going to share in a second, but then it evolves. And your work, it might evolve in different directions, but it's good to have a starting point, and from there, your own kind of creative personality can take it to different places. And one last image, this is a skyscape from a plane window, just moving the camera left and right. Again, I think I did it over about a minute, so this wasn't one moment when the sky was like this in front of me. I captured lots of images of this, and then on my computer put them together, this library of images, to create this one view where you can't see the plane wing, you can't see the window of the plane. It was from a jet plane, like flying towards, I think, to Italy or something. But I was able to get rid of the sense of the plane in front of me and create just this skyscape. So yeah, I hope that gives you an idea of how stitching images can be useful, and then hopefully towards the end it shows you how the limitations are kind of, there are no limitations. You can take the reality and rebuild it in your own way. You can add details to the landscape, you can rework landscapes, you can create impossible views of landscapes, you can be inside caves that are really cramped and capture the whole space. So it really is I guess if you're thinking of it as a creative tool, it's really powerful, and it allows you to capture images that maybe not every photographer can take. Once you kind of get a feel for this, you might have a little skill in your toolbox that other photographers won't have. So that's really useful if you're looking to create kind of images that grab people's attention, or if you're looking to do commissioned work of buildings in the city, then understanding how to stitch images in a kind of neat, creative way can be really important. Anyway, we're going to get back up to the river now, and I'm going to show you how to shoot the elements, and after that we're going to have a look in Photoshop on how to put those elements together, how to use layers and layer masks to build them.
Okay, so we're now through to the main tutorial bit. I'm going to show you how to shoot the images on your camera, and then I'm going to show you afterwards how to put them together in Photoshop. It's important to have your camera on manual settings because you want it a fixed exposure. So when you point your camera up, down, left and right, if you've got the sun in it, if you've got shadow area in it, you want that exposure to be consistent. So there is another tutorial on my playlist which tells you all about selecting and sticking at a manual exposure. It tells you about using your ISO, your shutter speed and your aperture to get a good manual exposure. And when you've got that, you can then do the stick, that you can then shoot the images which you will then stitch together in Photoshop. So let me grab my camera. Okay, so let me show you how we shoot the elements to make a stitch panoramic. So within the tutorial that looks at manual exposure, we know that we can use a combination of ISO, f-stop, which is your aperture, and your shutter speed to find a good exposure. Now the first thing I do to do this is select an ISO which should do a reasonable job. I know that it's quite a bright day, so ISO 200 is about right for me. And then I'll find an f-stop that should again do a good job, and I would say an f-stop is around f4 because there's quite a lot of shadow around, so f4 is fairly wide, so letting quite a lot of light in. And then I just use my shutter speed to get the image looking about right. So let's slowly move from 200 to 125, move it around, take a picture here, take a picture here. Okay, now that exposure is looking all right, maybe a little bit dark, so let's lighten up a tiny bit more. Okay, so I found a exposure of 125, shutter speed of 125, f-stop f4 and ISO 200. Now we need to create our grid of images. For this example we're going to be creating a grid of 9 images, so I'm going to show you a quick example of what that grid should look like. So you see here there's a center image, then an image above, an image below, and then an image right, an image left, and then images up, top left and bottom left and top right and bottom right. That's what you need to create. You need to move your camera around so you create a central image, and then you move above, below, left, right, and then the corners. So let's do that now. Okay, we're back at the river. I take my center image, then I move up, I take my top image. I'm making sure that at all times that the images overlap, so that's my center image there, and then my up image is there. Oh, let me see if I can do that. There's my center image, and then my up image is there, and there's always a bit around about 20% where they overlap. So let me just quickly start that again. There's my center image, there's my up image, below, and then left, left above, left below, and then we come over to the right and we do right. And remember to do that overlap area because that's the bit where you're going to join it in Photoshop. Right above, right below, and that's all of our images. So we've taken 9 images, of middle one, above, below, and then to the left and to the right, and the corners as well. And now we're going to go and have a look in Photoshop, and I'll show you how to put those images together.
So we have opened all 9 images into Photoshop, all 9 images of the river. Sometimes when you open images into Photoshop, they become tabbed at the top. So it's kind of like when you look at a web browser and sometimes you have the different pages in tabs at the top. And that can be a little bit of a pain when you're working on a composite because you want to see all your images at once. So it's quite simple. You can just drag those tabs out of the top bar and you start getting them all as individual photographs, which is a lot easier to deal with. Because the first job we need to do is get all 9 images next to each other and positioned. So I'm going to use the magnifying glass tool, and if I hold down the Alt key on a Mac keyboard, I can make the images smaller. And I need to just position them in their sort of relative positions. So we'll get all 9 images sort of in the place where they were when I took the pictures. So we start getting a sense. So that's my middle image. That's the most obvious there. So pop that in the middle there. Now that is probably the middle top. That looks like my bottom right, and that looks like top left. Okay, let me just make them all a tiny bit smaller, so and all the same size. So just use a magnifying glass to make them a little bit smaller. It's really good to do this first, because then you just double check you've got everything you need. So we've got 9 images. We've got our middle image there, which was the first one we took, then above, below, left, left above, left below, right, right above, right below. 9 images. Sometimes when you open them all up, you suddenly think, oh no, I've got a corner missing. That's a pain. Do I actually want to work on this, or look for another set where I maybe have got that corner? So it's good to do this, get them in their sort of relative positions. And already as you're doing this, you start to get a little bit of a sense of how they connect to each other and how it's going to look as a final image. So we need to start building our composite. We need to start bringing all these photographs into one image that's going to be bigger and wider. So the way I do that is, in this case, we're going to start on the central image. You don't always have to start on the central image, but most of the time I do, and then work my way out from the middle. So I'm just going to drag it so I've got a bit more room around it. And then I'm going to use the crop tool, which is in the toolbar. And the crop tool is, where's the crop tool? Why can't I see the crop tool? There's a crop tool. It's there. I tend to do everything by keyboard shortcuts, so I don't often know where things are. But the crop tool does the obvious thing that you might expect with crop. It allows you to crop into the image, but also it allows you to crop beyond the image and give yourself extra space to play with. So the first thing we do is we crop and give ourselves loads of empty canvas and hit return. I'm going to go even bigger. You can crop and then you can make it even bigger still. That gives us loads of empty space to play with. So you can see all that white area is extra room, and that gives us more than enough space to bring these 9 images in. So I'm now going to add my first image. I'm going to go for the order I shot them. So I'm going to go for the image directly above. So we click on that, the image we want to drop in, and then we go to select and select all. And you can see the lines going around that now. That means everything within that image is selected. And then if we go to edit and copy, and then just like if you're using a word processor document where you might want to copy and paste text, you can copy and paste images. So it's remembered that to the computer. And now if I click on that, and now if I go edit paste, we've suddenly got a new image in there. So the thing we're going to be looking at a lot here is our layer palette, because our layer palette is how all these different bits of images fit together. So we've dropped this new one in. If I get the move tool, which is the top left one from my toolbar, I can now move that to where I want. I can shift it around to wherever I want. And if you look at the layer palette, you can see as I move it around that this is layer 1, and the image in there moves as I shift it around. So I can put that where I want. I can put that in different places. It's really important to keep an eye on your layer palette and make sure you're working on the correct layer. In a second, when I've got 3 layers there, I'm going to do a quick real world demonstration of what the layer palette means. I did this as also in my tutorial on how to create an invisible person, how to work with composite images. And I think it really helped people out. It helped people visualize how the layer palette worked. So I'm going to show you some pieces of card that have these images on, and I'm going to put the layers together, because what you have to understand with the layer palette is, let me see if I can, is it's almost like a stack of paper. So the background layer is a piece of paper, layer 1 is a piece of paper, but whichever layer sits nearer the bottom of the screen, so in this case it's the background layer, and then we've got layer 1 on top. Whichever layer sits nearer the bottom of the screen is the piece of paper that's behind all the other pieces of paper. I know it's a bit confusing at the moment, so the demo I'll give you in a second should give you more of an idea. So this layer here sits near the top of the screen than the background layer. So that means that's a piece of paper that's going to sit on top of that other piece of paper, and it's going to conceal that piece of paper or that layer. So we want to position this layer. So to get the position right, I find the layer I want to work on, layer 1, and I put the opacity down to roughly 50. It doesn't have to be exact. And then I'm just going to use the magnifying glass tool to zoom in a little bit so I can see what I'm doing. And then I'll get the move tool again, and I can bring it in a little bit more. When the move tool selected, here's a handy little tip. You can also use the cursor keys to nudge the image around. So you can, that's me just using the cursor keys, not the mouse. So you can get it roughly in position. But because I shot it on a relatively wide angle lens at about 30mm, you've got wide angle distortion. So where the two images overlap, we talked about having that 20% overlap area. They don't perfectly overlap. Some of it overlaps, but some of it doesn't. You can see if we zoom in here, you've got that branch there overlaps nicely, but down here it goes a little bit strange. So we have to do a little bit of work to get the two images overlapping a little bit better. So to do that, we use the transform tool, and I'm going to encourage you to use the free transform tool. So if you go to the edit menu, and as long as we're clicked on layer 1, I click free transform, and you suddenly got all these handles, and you can move that around, you can reshape it, you can do all sorts to it. I'm going to just undo that and go again. So it's in the edit menu, and you've got free transform there. Now what's really handy is if you hold down the command key, each corner is a handle that you can manipulate separately. You don't move it as a square, so you can start reshaping that image, and we can get more of those trees overlapping than there were originally. Now I'm just going to zoom in a little bit closer still and get my layer palette out of the way for a second. And what we're trying to do is, we're not trying to get all of this 20% overlap area sitting on top of, we're not trying to get that so that sits, so that lines up perfectly from both images. So top to bottom it lines up. We're looking to get a line that runs across where the images overlap and they sit together. So don't try and get that entire area coinciding so both images sit on top of each other. You just have to get a bit of it, a strip of it that lines up. And as soon as I hit return, that transform is applied. So that layer 1 is, instead of being a square, it is now a kind of off square shape. So I'm now going to put my opacity back up to 100% on that layer 1. And if we move back, it's starting to look correct. It's starting to feel like it's one image is joined to the other. But then if you go in really close, you'll notice that at the bottom of layer 1, you get little offsets like this here. That you can actually, if you go in really close, you can see the straight line at the bottom of there. Now we don't want that. What we need to do is, there was that point where the images overlap. We need to eat away at layer 1 to that point where they overlap. So we're going to use layer masks. I'm going to click on the layer, and then I'm going to click on, at the bottom of the layer palette, you've got a grey square with a black circle in the middle of. If I click that, we now have a layer mask sitting next to that layer. So you've got the layer and the layer mask. At the moment, that layer mask is 100% white, which means everything of the layer is attached to, I'm telling Photoshop to make 100% visible. If I just turn off that background layer so we can see through, so all of that layer is 100, all that layer mask is 100% visible, so all of that layer is fully visible as well. Sorry, all of that layer mask is 100% white, so all of the layer it's attached to is 100% visible. If I go to my toolbar and I get a black brush, so you can alternate the colors there, and I'll make it a bit bigger, so let me just make that a bit bigger. There we go, that's about right. Now, as long as I'm clicking on my layer mask here, so not on the image, that's the image there, but on the layer mask, I can now eat a big hole in that image. and it's disappearing. It's almost like you might think that's the erase tool. You might think I'm just erasing the image. But if we look up here, if we look closely at the layer mask, you can see it's got a bit of black on. Let me make a brush a bit bigger so you can see that a bit clearer. So get rid of all that and then look at the layer mask. There's a speck of black. That's me painting black onto the layer mask, and that's me telling Photoshop not to show any of the image it sits next to in the area I've painted black. But if I now get a brush, let's make it a little bit smaller and white. Let's bring that down a bit. I haven't used the erase tool, so that information's still there. All that's happened is I've told Photoshop not to show it by working on a layer mask. If I now get a white brush, click on the layer mask, I can bring that image back. So here it comes. I can bring it all back. In fact, I am going to bring it all back because I need to subtly get rid of it. So there you go. So a white brush makes the white makes the layer mask show the image it's next to. Black, so let me get a black brush there, makes the image that the layer mask is attached to, it conceals it. Okay, I'm going to hit the undo tool now. Oh, the undo button. There we go. So I need to eat away at layer 1, this one we've brought in, up to the point where it lines up nicely with the tree. So I'm on my layer mask. I'm going to get a black brush. I'm going to make it a little bit smaller. I'm going to make it about 300, maybe a bit smaller to 200. That'll do. And now if I zoom in a little bit, we see that leading edge that doesn't line up nicely. I can slowly work my way up that leading edge and join it. So that tree now feels like it works, feels like the two images sit on top of each other. And now if I come in over here, I can see other details where I need to work into it. And basically that entire flat line at the bottom of layer 1 needs to go, because there's no point where that flat line is going to work and be sympathetic. You have to subtly eat into it. You can sometimes hide details amongst the trees, but you basically don't want a sharp edge to a layer that's overlapping another layer, because you will see it. So we can slowly work our way back. This image is quite forgiving because you can kind of conceal what branch they're doing behind the trees a little bit. Sometimes if you're working on buildings or kind of more geometric shapes, you have to be a bit more precise. Also, if you use the eyes on the layers, you can see what you've left. Sometimes you realize you've left bits, so you can go back in with your black brush. So you slowly work your way, doing it by eye, just getting it so one image hands over to the other in a way that's sympathetic and nice. There we go. And now I haven't done much over here yet, but I can flick the eyes on and off to just see if I've left anything. All these branches here don't line up, so if I work on my layer mask and slowly join them up, that's looking much better. And we're just looking for that handover from one image to the other. That's why we did that 20% overlap when we were taking the photographs. This is a 20% we're working in now. That area of overlap gives me a bit of wriggle room to join the two images. So this is that 20% overlap I'm working in at the moment. And in that 20% overlap, if I zoom out, we have now got a lovely handover from one image to the other. So, there's still loads of weird bits left. Just give that a quick tidy up. So we have a nice handover from one image to the other, and that looks all right. Okay, I'm going to do the same thing again and bring in this bottom layer, the third photograph we took. And I'm going to talk you through it again, but we're also going to pause for a second, and I'm going to do a bit more of a demo, a real world demo of what your layers are doing, just so we can really cement that idea of the layers being like a stack of paper. So clicking on that bottom layer, we'll go select all, and then we go edit, copy, and it remembers that entire layer. And we can even close that now because we know it's remembered, and the top layer, we can close that also. So now we click on the image we're working on where we create all that extra canvas around the middle layer. And then we go paste. Look at our layer palette. We now have 3 layers. So we've got the top one we've dropped in and added our layer mask. Now we've got the bottom one. Okay, and as long as I'm clicked on that, if I go to my move tool, I can position it. I can move it around and put it in place. I always encourage people to work on it a layer at a time. I do workshops in colleges and schools and photography groups, And sometimes I can see how people get in a muddle, especially when they've done this for the first time. So I encourage people to add a layer at a time, do your layer mask, not bring too many images in, and then bring the next one in. And always try and keep your layer palette neat. So if you bring a new one in, have that sitting on top so you know what it's doing. Sometimes weird things can happen. You can bring layers in, and if you have it in the wrong position, so if I have that layer 2 there, it suddenly starts slotting between two layers and getting a bit confusing. So having it at the top, copying and pasting it into as your top layer in the layer palette is really useful. Now, let me just zoom in a bit, and I'm going to put the opacity of that in my layer palette to 50, around about 50, and I can just guide it in fairly near. Remember, you've got, as long as you're on the move tool, you've got your cursor keys, so you can nudge it around a little bit. And then we're ready to do our transform tool. So holding down the command key on a Mac, I'm not sure what it is on a PC, but I'm sure you can work it out. We move our handles around and we get as much lining up in those stones at the bottom as possible. Again, this will be quite forgiving because a lot of the area where we're trying to match up is just the noise of that water. So we can kind of get away with quite a lot. It's probably even more forgiving than the upper bit where we had actual trees and branches that we needed to give a sense continued from one image to the other. So that looks okay. I'm going to hit return, and now that third layer is an interesting sort of trapezoid shape. Let's put my opacity back up to 100% there. Sorry, my brain went blank. Okay, I just want to do a quick real world demo of it at the moment to show how those layers are interacting. Now we've got 3 layers. I can kind of explain this a bit clearer. Let me just save it. It's always good to save your files as you go along. So we'll call this example, and we'll call it layers. And as long as I save it as a Photoshop file, a large document format, or a TIFF, there might even be some others, but they're the main ones I use. And as long as the layer box is clicked as I save it, all of that information in the layer palette is remembered. The layer masks, the layers. So if I hit save, it saves it with all that information. So at any time, as long as I'm pretty careful with my saving, I can go back into it and I can edit my layer mask, I can tidy it up, I can adjust things if I made slight mistakes, or I can do a kind of rough put together at this stage just to see how it works. And then later, when I've got a bit more time and a bit more space, I can go in a bit more fine detail and get it put spot on. So I'm saving this now, but basically I want to show you how how layers work, so you can just get a bit of an understanding. So there's going to be a cutaway box in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen, and I'm showing you one piece of paper. That first piece of paper is the background layer, the layer that's at the lowest in the layer palette. So it's the layer that's nearest the bottom, and that's our central image, the first one we worked on, plus the extended canvas, this extra white space I've created to drop the extra images in. Now we're going to bring in another image. This is layer 1, and this is the top part of the image. And you can see there that I'm putting it on top of the background layer. I'm putting it on top of the background layer because I'm showing you what the layers are doing at the moment. And because that layer is higher up the layer palette, it sits on top of the background layer. Now I'm going to bring in a third piece of paper, and that is layer 2. Now layer 2 is right at the top of the layer palette. So that is a piece of paper that sits on top of all the other pieces of paper. So let me overlap them here. So that sits on top of the background layer, that sits on top of layer 1, and all the other layers are hidden behind it. But if I change the layer order, so if I take layer 2 and put it underneath layer 1 in Photoshop, and you can see I'm doing that in real life as well. So that sits beneath layer 1, which is now the top piece of paper. It sits beneath that, but because it's the middle piece of paper, it's above the background layer in the layer palette, it's still sitting above that background layer. The background layer tends to stay where it is. You have to double click on it just to make it a normal layer. But if you do double click on it, you can then move it around. You can make that your top layer. So let's quickly swap those around. Now the other two are beneath it because they're lower down the layer palette. So you can't see them. They're hidden behind. Let me move that out of the way. You can see these 2 layers beneath. basically, the thing I'm trying to explain is that the order of the layers in the layer palette is really, really important. And whichever layer is nearest the bottom of the screen is a piece of paper that all the other pieces of paper are on top of. If you get 9 layers, which you will in the end, the same rules apply, but you just have it over 9 layers. So the last layer I put in will be the top one. Sometimes you might want to change your layer order. There's lots you can do to kind of mess with it, but just understand that that order is how these pieces of paper are positioned next to each other. So let's continue working on this and let's get it finished. So we can turn our opacity down on that layer 2. Oh, I've put it in the wrong place. I need to put that at the top. Okay, and then let's move in a little bit closer. And there we go. I'll use my arrow keys to nudge it around. And now I'm going to put that back up to 100%. And then I'll create a layer mask on that layer 2. So that's a grayed out square of the black circle. Now we've got the white layer mask. So now we go to our palette and get our brush and make sure that's a black brush. So I make that black. And then we carefully hand over from one image to the other. I'm going to change my brush size. You can actually change your brush size using the keyboard shortcuts. So the bracket keys make it bigger and larger. So you can see that the brackets are making it bigger and larger. And another thing you can do is you can change the opacity of your brush just by pressing the number keys. So if we go to 4, we can, we can get rid of a bit of a layer. We can make a layer translucent. It's not all black and white layer masks. If you paint 100% white in a layer, it makes it 100% visible. If you paint 100% black in a layer, it makes it 100% invisible. But if you use grays or a low opacity brush, you can just kind of make it slightly see-through, make it translucent, which can be useful. It's not really what we're looking at in this particular tutorial. Let's bring that back. But just know that you don't have to move in total black and whites in layer masks. You can suggest it. You can be a bit more subtle, which when you're trying to be a bit more sort of painterly with your Photoshop can be really useful. Right. So I'm just going to do a nice blend there and get them handing over nicely from one to the other. And remember to close the eye, because on the layers beneath you can suddenly see all these weird bits you've left behind that you might not notice because they're so similar to what's there, but actually if you do a print you can suddenly see them and you think, oh no, why did I leave that there? And if you turn that back on, you've got 3 layers blended together. So I'm going to continue and put all the other 9 layers together, but I'm not going to talk you through it. I might just talk you through the next one, but really quick. So here we go. I'm going to click on the left layer, the order we shot them, and I'm going to go select all. That's all selected. I'm going to go edit and copy. I'm going to close that layer, and then I'm going to go edit and paste, and then I'm going to put my opacity down. I'm going really quick here because I showed it to you a couple of times already. I'm going to position that. I'm then going to use my free transform tool from the edit menu. I can't see it, free transform. And then I'm going to use the command key to nudge those corners around and get as much of it lining up as possible. That's kind of looking okay. Yes, I'm happy with that. I'm hitting return. It's applying that new shape to it. I'm putting my opacity back up. I use the keyboard shortcut because I'm being annoying. But basically, I put the opacity up. If you press numbers on your keyboard, whilst you're on the move tool, you can select the opacity. So you can just press 0 and it puts your opacity right up. Layer mask, I'm going to click on the grayed out square with the black circle in. White layer mask. Now I'm going to get a brush, make sure that's a black brush. And then I'm going to blend the 2 images. So get that nice handover from one image to the other. That's looking pretty good. But then if I turn that off, we'll just see if we've got anything weird left behind. We've got a few unusual details there. And that's it. Okay, I'm going to quickly rattle through this and then I'm going to show you the final stages of this process. So we'll see a sped up version of me doing it, and then I'll talk you through flattening the image and saving it. Remember, as you're working through it, to save it as often as possible, especially in layers, because then you'll be able to go back, or if your computer crashes, you'll have it still there. Okay, so let's fast forward now. Okay, that's all the layers put together. I did something slightly different on a couple of layers there. I suddenly realized I created an all black layer mask on a few of those layers. If you hold down the, what is it? Let me just double check. If you hold down the Alt key whilst creating a layer mask, instead of it being a pure, if you hold down the Alt key whilst clicking on the layer mask button, the grayed out circle with the grayed out square with the black circle, you get a black layer mask, and then you can get a white brush and bring your detail in. Have a go at both. Have a go at white and then using black to eat away at the detail, but then sometimes holding down Alt and making an all black layer mask to conceal everything, and then using a white brush to bring the detail back works as well. I'm not quite sure which is best, but just have a play with both while you're doing it, because both are quite useful. Anyway, we have our image here. I'm going to save it as example layer finished. Let me just do that. And it's as a TIFF with layers, so all that layer information is remembered. It's looking quite good. So the final stages on a composite are to flatten it. So you've got your layer palette there. If we go to these 3 lines in the top right, you've got flatten image. If we click that, all of that information, let me just undo it again. So all of those layers, all of that layer masks, flatten image, there we go, becomes just one image, like it was a single photograph from the camera. This wide image we've been working on is suddenly much bigger, like a single photograph, all flat, which is great. You can do some quite cool things at this stage. If the edges become a little bit skew width, you can kind of select all. So I've just got my square marquee tool there from the toolbar, and I've selected it all, and now I'm going to go edit and free transform. We can now, because it's flattened, we can make adjustments to the whole thing at once. So we can use that command free transform to get the handle, and we can just slowly tweak it and bring it all together, maybe just neaten it up, work on the perspective, and then hit return, and suddenly it's a whole new shape. You've got that extra shape going on, which is quite cool. And it's flat as well, so we can now crop into it. So we can crop, and we're using the crop in the more traditional way here. We're using it to make the image smaller instead of extending our canvas. And we hit return, and sometimes you can have a bit of weird detail where you can have the edge of the image that loses a bit. So you can go and get the rubber stamp tool. So that's this tool here, the clone stamp tool. Let's make the brush a bit bigger. So I'll make that 63, no, maybe a bit bigger. I'll make it 91. That's, oh, it doesn't seem to be. There we go. And now this is a great tool. If you hold down the Alt key, it creates a target, and then you can paint that detail across. There we go. And let's go down here. And now there's a bit of the water here, which we didn't quite get right. That's the edge of the image. So if we hold down the Alt key, it makes a target there. Then I click, and it selects the target from that point. And now I've let go of the Alt key, and I can paint that detail into a different place. It's really handy. It's quite a fun tool to play with. You can give someone the same head 5 times or something like that. We're using it in quite a kind of sensible way here, but you can do some really silly things with the clone tool. So you hold down the Alt key as a target, and then you paint the detail over that. There we go. and that's just tidied up those edges. And then because it's a totally flat image, you can do image adjustments to the whole thing. So you could use a simple image adjustment. You could, oh, I didn't want to use that one. You could go image adjustment, brightness and contrast, which is the simple one to use, and you can do the whole thing at once. Or you can, if you like using levels, you can go to levels in there, and you can play with your midpoint. You can lighten up those shadow areas. Or I tend to enjoy using colors, so you can go in and I like using curves, so you can go into curves there, and you can pick different bits of the color range and pull it out. And you can also start playing with your color channels as well, so you can bring in a bit of red, add a bit of nice warmth to it, give it a bit of glow. And because it's flat, it does it across the whole image at once and gives it that lovely feel. And then it makes it look a bit more painterly. And because you got all that detail to work with, you can really work into it. You can work into the colors and be really creative. You can even go in and work in single areas. So we've got the lasso tool here in the toolbar, and you can just, if you see a color that's doing something nice, like this red warmth there, you can do a rough lasso there. You can go to select and you can modify and feather that, make it nice and feathered at 66 or something. If you hit Q, you actually see what the feather's doing. So you get this blurry outline that tells you what the edge of it's doing, because otherwise you wouldn't quite know what that's doing. You wouldn't know what your feathering did, whereas hitting Q shows you what you did. But then you can go adjustments, curves, and you can just start introducing a few interesting little pickup colors, bring a bit of red, a bit of rust into there. But that's it. Then you can save it. You should have a layered version saved before you flattened it. That's always sensible. But then you can save the final version here. We'll call it flat finished. Flat finished, finished, and there we go. Sometimes you have a few generations. It's saved a few different ways. You have the first 3 layers and 9 layers, and you might then flatten it and then work more layers into it. But that's it. That's basically how you create a composite. Let's make it full screen so you can see it. I hope that was useful. Have a go yourself. Any questions, let me know. And also, if there's any subjects you'd like me to cover, let me know. And there's a lot that I've talked about in this tutorial, such as manual settings, that might be useful here. There's also another tutorial all about creating an invisible person, which again uses layer masks and layers in a similar way. So these 2 tutorials might sort of click together quite nicely. I tend to, when I'm teaching, do both tutorials in the same day. But yeah, I hope this has been useful, and thanks for watching. And if you know anyone else that might be interested in it, please share it with them and subscribe. Yeah, thanks a lot.